Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond Jr., and today I'm welcoming Rohadi Nagassar. Rohadi's latest book is When We Belong, Reclaiming Christianity on the Margins from Herald Press. Rohadi writes and speaks on the topics of decolonizing, liberation, and deconstructing Western Christianity. He has his own podcast, Faith and a Fresh Vibe. He has planted 2 churches, including an inner-city multi-ethnic expression called Cypher Church. He has also written extensively in the area of missions and church leadership, including his book, Thrive, Ideas to Lead Church in Post-Christendom, which we'll be talking about today. He lives in Canada on Treaty 7 lands, otherwise known as Calgary, and holds a business certificate from Mount Royal College, a BA in economics from the University of Calgary, and an MDiv from Canadian Theological Seminary. You can find out more about him at rohadi.com and find him online there too. So welcome to the show. All right, welcome to the show, Rohadi Nagassar. Thanks so much for being here. Anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you?
Yeah, I'm situated north of you. I'm in Canada.
Yeah.
On what is traditionally Treaty 7 territory, or known as Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, and which is situated 3.5 hours north of the Montana border and about an hour east of Banff. So most people know where Banff is.
Well, I don't think I've had a few folks from Canada, but I think you're the first one I've had from really outside the Toronto area. So yeah. Thanks for being here.
Which is far. It's like that's like a 4-hour flight.
Yeah. Well, share, if you would, with our listeners. Share a little bit about your faith story, what that's looked like in the past, and what that looks like today.
Yeah, I grew up in what I would call white evangelicalism. We didn't call it that then.
Mm-hmm.
So in many respects, the contemporary evangelical movement that's in the U.S., it's the same, effectively, in Canada. We borrow everything. Yet evangelicals are a much smaller percentage of the population here, so there's less political clout, there's less cultural influence. Canada is more of a post-Christian sort of world. It would mimic some of the larger inner cities in America in terms of religiosity. So the first half of my life, that was my place in space. Knew all the songs, heard all the sermons, read all the books, same books. So that formation looked very similar if you grew up in that space. Then I went to seminary. After university, went to seminary and realized there was something going on. There was a problem in terms of what I named at first mission. So I knew that the church seemed to be incompetent at connecting with people that didn't look like it, or at least the churches that I was associated with.
Yeah.
It was a deeper question than that I realize now, even 10 years after the fact, or 15 years after the fact, that I was trying to figure out how I could, as a multi-ethnic person, belong ultimately in church spaces, in predominantly white church, where I was situated, white church spaces. That was the question. But initially I was using language around mission. So today I would situate my faith outside of institutional boundaries, outside of evangelicalism. I'm more connected to faith traditions that operate at the margins of culture. There's no Black church influence here, but Black church or Black theologians, liberation theology, all these pieces that often were chided as being too liberal or left,
Right.
are the ones that are, in fact, resonating with me because they speak to my space and how I situate myself in the world. And faith and church-wise, as a church planter, which no one would use that terminology, but that's what makes sense, I think, for your listeners.
Yeah.
I've spent now the time of trying to build more inclusive across all spectrums, including ethnicity, so more multi-ethnic, more inclusive to disabled folks, more inclusive to LGBTQ folks, how to build and curate and just rest in those types of community spaces. And so that's kind of where I'm meandering now in a slow and simple and small way.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Share, if you would, like a spiritual practice, something that's meaningful for you now.
Yeah, you know what I've been becoming more alert to right now, and not right now, but over a number of years, and especially poignant once the pandemic struck. But I've been into aspects of somatic healing, which is just a fancy way of saying being more attentive to my body.
Mm-hmm.
And so the spiritual or even, body practices of trying to be more in tune with what's going on in myself. Because we, and by we, I mean, contemporary Christianity.
Yeah.
So evangelicals, Protestants, mostly, we're really good at the thought exercise and figuring things out in our head, but we dissociate our body in many respects from ourselves. We treat them as a separate thing. We haven't been taught how to love ourselves as the commandment goes, to love our neighbor as ourselves, but we don't even know how to do that to ourselves and to our own bodies. So there's a lot of learning there because in my own formation and maybe part of it growing up culturally as a man, that you dissociate from the things that you're feeling, the emotions that you might have, unless the emotion is rage or anger.
Right.
I get that. But so there are pieces there of learning and being more attentive to what is in many respects countercultural. Somatic healing or I don't think somatic theology is actually a thing, but being more attentive to my body is something that I've engaged with over a number of years now.
Yeah, awesome. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. So I asked Rohadi to come on the show and kind of found you on Twitter, thought you had some interesting stuff to say, and I was like, hey, is there something, some work that I can interact with that we could talk about? And he sent me his book, Thrive, and I really want to recommend folks they can find it at your website, rohadi.com, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And really recommend checking it out. It's a digital download. You can easily read it on your phone or tablet or whatever your electronic reading thing is. You can buy a book
of it.
Yeah.
I think it's on Amazon. You can easily get it.
But I thought we talked through some of the stuff you have in here, which I thought was really interesting. I made a lot of highlights, frankly, in my highlighting app, and I had to limit it here a bit for our sake of conversation timeliness. Yeah. But the first thing that really stuck out to me, and I feel like it's, I don't know what you think, like a really main theme of the book is that you kind of point out that common answers to church decline are Christendom-centric.
Yeah. I feel like the way that, again, things shift, right? So when I respond here, it's kind of a snapshot in time. And when I wrote this book, that was almost 10 years ago, yet the applications remain the same in many respects. And that the churches often try to address their decline by just revamping what's inside incrementally. we don't have a lot of good input to self-reflect and say, actually, the approaches that we keep on using, they just don't work. So just sort of changing the style of music, it's not going to work. Now, understand I'm operating out of my context, which is a preview where America is going, which is probably where your big cities are at. There could be many smaller towns where the majority of folks have some connection to church and or church life and world, that you could just change the music a little bit and that might work. But at the end of the day, you're just rinsing and washing the same people. You're just stealing them from other churches. You know?
Right.
It's like you managed to stay afloat, or maybe you're even growing as a church, but you did that at the expense of all the churches closing around you. So I don't think that's really a depth strategy or even good mission.
Yeah. Yeah, I just listened to something the other day, a podcast the other day, talking about a report from Christianity Today, at least in America, mind you, that non-denoms had primarily experienced growth in the past from folks leaving a mainline context.
Yeah.
And now they're getting growth from ex-Catholics.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I did that data work as well in my book, and looked at, that's interesting because your trends in that article, I would assume, are newer than my data, but the data that I was looking at was saying the same things, and that effectively there was no denomination or tradition that was growing by adding new folks. It was Christian transfers, folks who were already churched. It was Christian immigration, which is how Catholic churches have generally increased. So they are already Christian, and you just immigrated, or births. So you just had enough kids within to keep things rolling, which I think the number is like 3-4%. You just have a couple of kids every year and the church can keep on rolling. And you don't have to change anything, right? And so when it comes to even evangelical churches who are supposed to be reaching out more than others, evangelicalism, or rather growth by evangelizing, is actually one of the lowest factors that contribute to growth. Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay, so what are we actually doing?
Well, kind of to that point you made, what are we actually doing? I thought it was interesting that you wrote that oftentimes what happens is churches seek examples from quote unquote exceptional churches. And I think this is kind of happens a lot in evangelical spaces where it's like, what's the growing hip church doing that we can replicate, like you said, music or whatnot. So what do you see as the problems of that?
And this was, I feel like this is changing somewhat, but you always seem to, when I was sort of in the mix, and this was a long time ago, but they always send your pastors or maybe a denominational leader or your church planners to certain conferences, right? Mm-hmm. It's just like the same ones. And there was a kick there for a while where every single year, leadership development was huge and still is in evangelical spaces. And so you always went to Leadership Summit. Now, you never heard of a Discipleship Summit, but you always went to Leadership Summit. Right? So you always went to these church planting conferences to see and hear the stories of churches that were actually growing, because that's just wild. Like in our imagination, that's like, how are you doing this? And so what happens is that you raise up all of these exceptional churches, and you can think of the vast majority of churches are small. They're around 100. And yet we use these churches that have thousands of people, the mega churches, and we use them as examples of what we can emulate and replicate. And the problem is when you operate within a model that centers the consumer Christian model, which means that you try to deliver the best products and services, essentially, if we're talking consumerism, that if you're going to try to replicate the biggest and brightest, you better have a budget that can do the same. But the fact is you can't. So what are you going to do? Is that you're going to replicate, you're going to try at least, these products and services, but you're going to be replicating them at such a poor level
Right.
That by trying to do the same things, you're in fact going to alienate your own people who are, or this could be a good thing, by the way, you'll alienate the consumer Christians within your community, and they'll just leave your community for the better show down the road.
Right.
Which is exactly what happens when it comes to churches that try to compete along the lines of trying to do the best kind of music or trying to offer the best Christmas show. Or try to, it's like you can't compete with one another. You better have something else that's going to ground you, because replicating the ones that look great, it better come with a bunch of money too. And then it becomes a race to the top in terms of money, and that just dilutes everything, and that's its own problem. But we got to stop looking at all these churches from conferences, from books, from wherever, and try to look, I think, locally within our context and hopefully usually the neighborhood, and see what we can champion and learn from and collaborate with within that context.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Something else that I thought was interesting, you write about finding allies in the kingdom, not just those with the same denominational logo. So I don't know what it's like up in Canada. Certainly in the States, denominationalism is very much on the decline. Even still within denominations, depending on the denomination, there can very much be like a, hey, we only work with our own, or those very much like us. I found your approach refreshing, and I'm curious, what brought that about?
Well, when you don't have, first off, when you don't operate within denominational boundaries, then you better try to find other people to collaborate with, because you don't have your own people to begin with. So there are positives here in that you would have some type of network behind you within the denomination. But if you're only looking to church plant, and I'll use that as an example, church plant within old paradigm, then you would typically just try to grow the denominational banner.
Right.
Whereas if you approach mission through a lens of trying to incarnate Christ in the neighborhood, then it becomes more expansive in terms of what you're trying to achieve. And that is, you don't care who gets the credit. You don't really care who you're collaborating with. You're looking to join God where God is already at work in the neighborhood or the city. It doesn't matter of what stripes an organization is wearing. So in many respects, scarcity produces a state where you have to find different ways and innovative ways to collaborate with other organizations trying to do the same thing. Maybe your denomination, or maybe your approach is that you just refuse to collaborate with any non-Christian organizations. Again, that's way too narrow, but at least that extends past denominationalism. I would take the approach through the lens of who is just trying to do good things in the neighborhood, right? Because God works. God is not confined to the church. Would be ridiculous to think that God is in fact at work beyond in the world, with or without the permission of the church.
Yeah,
of course. And so it's up to us to try to respond and find where God is at work and join. And our posture as church, it comes from the top, unfortunately. It comes from the place where we're used to being the boss all the time. People come to us for answers, right? We don't have a good posture of humility where we realize that there's a lot of other organizations or people who have more expertise and are doing things better than the church, especially when it comes to building goodness and hope in neighborhoods. So if culture, if our cities and towns are changing in a way that folks are no longer defaulting to find a church to find the answers to life's questions, then the church ought to shift to accommodate that cultural shift rather than just waiting for people to come to it, which is generally that's still stuck in our DNA.
Yeah, it really speaks to the Christendom-centric ideology whatever the word is that you speak about is that I think most churches still think like if someone's going through a crisis or need of some support, like church is like the first thought for people. And if I understand you right, you're arguing, and I would certainly agree that's not no longer the case in many contexts.
It would be nice. I mean, it would be nice, but what we find I'm painting with too broad of a brush now, but what we find is many churches have lost their way in terms of being the parish church, of being that neighborhood church where people would seek it out for help. Many churches carry with them a lot of baggage now. There's a growing mistrust with the church in general, right? So what do we have to do to, I don't want to say change hearts and minds, but to do better and to have better practices that aren't situated within the closed confines of the church walls?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not sure how to ask this question, but because I think the answer would be no. But how do current structures, this is the question: can current structures accommodate the necessary shifts that need to happen, or do you think the structures themselves need to change entirely?
So you already know the answer, of course, right? It's like, can the church change? And the answer is yes and no. The only way institutions can change is through incrementalism, and that is just a fancy way to say very slowly over a long period of time. So it is possible, because we do see institutions, maybe actually we see institutions most often just die, which makes a lot of sense. So are they built to do that, however? And the answer to that is absolutely not. Institutions are designed for self-preservation. They're designed to keep things the same. And they're designed to, in fact, reject those who try to push it into a new space, which is sad because one of the gifts of the church is the voice of the prophet. And yet most traditions do not have space for the prophet. The prophet has to, just like scripture, it has to go into the desert and hang out. And they're just sort of off the rocker, and we don't trust them. And we would reject them anyways because they speak truth to power. And right now there is a preservation of power, and that's what institutions do, rather than a way to divest itself from power for the sake of the expansive kingdom in our midst. So there is no change, I don't think, readily possible. It would take, I think, new ideas, new folks operating either outside or at the edge of inside to give input, to give insight for denominations or the institution of new possibilities. So, which is to say, we'll use church planning as an example. We've often thought, okay, we'll just let those people, those church planners who don't want to keep things the same inside the church, we'll let them go out and maybe we'll learn something from them and they'll change things up a little bit. That's still incrementalism. And I think that every church should, if you're big enough, why not cleave off 150 people and drop them into a different neighborhood? That's a transplant, not necessarily a plant, but makes sense. What I'm saying is we need a total reimagination of how to do church and how to be Christians in a new city and in a new culture. And in order to do that, we need to fund, I think, because oftentimes it's a money question, is that we need to fund, rather than 6 figures for the traditional church plant, why not fund 10 people who are doing interesting things in their neighborhood in totally different ways than we would ever consider even something as church, as a church expression? Why not fund 10 at 1/10 of the price and see what works and what sticks? So there's just a need for a radical reorientation of how we cultivate innovation within denominations. And some are kind of going in this direction, especially those that are facing the brink.
Yeah.
We need to figure out, okay, throw as much as we can at the wall, see what sticks, and then maybe develop around there. Otherwise, I don't think the institution has a hope to make any sizable changes in time for it to save itself. And I think of many mainline traditions. If you look in Canada, mainline traditions that have lost 90% of members over 50 years, like they're dead in another generation, right? So evangelicals think of themselves as resilient, but there's really not a lot saying that you're going to not wind up in the same place in 50 years. So let's try to do something that just doesn't center the cathedral model where people just come to the Sunday service. Do something, doesn't have to even be big. Like try something where you're really bankrolling new innovative ideas and people, and then use the information that they produce as input of how you might shift the organization, or just continue funding these off the wall ideas, because we're not going back to a place where everyone just casually returns to a Sunday morning service. Like COVID should have also caught halved the number of people who thought I need a Sunday service. Like has your church come back to pre-COVID levels? Like many haven't.
No.
So it's just an indicator of what is to come. And we ought to then figure out what might be the next or multiple next things to try to match how quickly culture is shifting beyond us, rather than trying to call people back to something they probably won't.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I think the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church here in the States, has done something to that effect where they'll give out, I want to say it's like $10,000, I think, to someone who's doing something innovative or new churchy. And if I read your bio right, you have a business degree background, so I imagine this will kind of make sense to you. You know, the idea of like throwing all your eggs in one basket and hoping, there's a lot of pressure, obviously, for, if you're throwing six-figure or monies at one project, like that's gotta work. And
and you have your systems for that, and you have your assessments for that, right? So we know to do that, and sometimes it works, right? So that's fine. That's one thing, as you said. In the book, I give the story through a business lens, because I don't think businesses, those types of corporate institutions can change either. So what they do instead is they try to pivot and create these offshoots from them. And so they can respond, because that's the other thing with institutions. They can't respond to immediate problems quickly. It takes it forever to shift. For example, a lot of white churches, how do they respond to George Floyd and just the movement that sprung up from there? Very few didn't, because they were just trying to figure like, how do we pivot? And the institution is not designed to do that. So yeah, the example of trying to do $10,000 to the small thing. The only thing, so I see that quite often. What it's missing, however, the crucial factor here is time. And so we run out of patience. And so that's the institution runs out of patience far shorter than it should. Yeah. Which is to say, you need that 10 grand for a decade. Yeah. That's what you need. You need that patience, because if you're doing it for 1, 2, 3 years, you're not going to get the results in this post-Christian world. Assuming results is what you're after. Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Good point. Something else I want to have you talk through is, in the book you talk about spiders versus starfish, and then the spiderfish church. Can you talk through kind of those three different models? So I just sort of alluded to it with the business idea. And this is popularized, I think, a business writer, Ori Braffman, and then Alan Hirsch, who I think many folks in the missional church world would know. And he uses the example of starfish. and how if a starfish loses its appendage, it still has the DNA to create a new starfish.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the spider, if you lose its head, then the whole organization collapses.
Mm-hmm.
And most churches are spiders in that they're heavily dependent on the one
Right.
charismatic leader. And when that leader kind of goes, then the church goes with it. And what we've done in terms of building towards charismatic leaders or in one place is that we have not released people to be the hands and feet unto God's unfolding mission. And we've really detracted from the priesthood of all believers, which as good Protestants, we should believe.
Mm-hmm.
But in practice, we don't do that. So the starfish model comes out. And so what I suggest is actually we need a combination in many respects. And this is through my experience, at least, in that we can't just go completely flat in our organization, in communities or churches. There is a sense of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
There still is. So we definitely need to be intentional with imparting DNA into all folks to be okay using their gifts and abilities for the sake of joining God in the unfolding kingdom, for the sake of building the church. Everyone has those. Yet we don't release people to go and live out their gifts. We don't do it well, rather. So we need that. But at the same time, there still needs to be a component where there's shared leadership or rather there is leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I use the example of top heavy churches, the typical churches versus very flat house churches. And very flat house churches, the knock is they'll never get anything done,
right.
Or they can't do really big, important things because they can't mobilize enough resource, or they can't centralize themselves temporarily towards a single focus. So I think there's a combination there that's required in my own church planting. If you just let people, figure it out for themselves, it's like, oh yeah, mission, just like whatever you want, go do it. Folks won't do it. And so there is intentionality behind forming and shaping
mm-hmm.
folks to both respond and identify spaces they can live out their gifts,
mm-hmm.
But also, and this is the key, how they might replicate and do so in their own space and build those skills and abilities in other people. That's the replicating factor that the starfish, the power of the starfish model. And that's where the vast majority of churches fall flat in that, boy, we can disciple a bunch of people who come to a class. We'll do that all day, right?
Mm-hmm.
But will those people go and disciple other people? And that's the challenging part. So yeah, there's a mix there in terms of organizational development and what it looks like. Leadership is still important, but it's definitely not in the top heavy way we're used to. It's definitely doesn't have to be the one man or the one MDiv or the one accredited pastor. It can change. Like it can change who leads depending on seasons,
mm-hmm.
right? Which is a totally different kind of form of leadership than we're used to. So that's out there. And in many ways, it reflects sort of the flatter way of a more organic way of organizing our communities in a post-Christian context.
Yeah, I like your idea of like leadership changing based on season, if I'm hearing you right.
Yeah.
I've often thought that like I'm definitely a fan of leadership and appreciate good leadership, but I've often thought like if one person is making all the decisions all the time, like that's a problem.
Well, yeah, and you get paid to do that, right? And that's what the paid clergy model.
Mm-hmm.
You are assumed you do that stuff,
right?
And so you really got to work against the grain, especially if it's mostly Christians and people who grew up in the church, how they understand how the church should operate. Like that's really hard to change that mindset in that, no, you can do these things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but we pay you to do these things.
Right.
So why would we? And so I've never pulled in full salary. I've never even pulled in half salary. So there isn't pragmatic space in our communities where I would do all things. You just can't. You have to do them. If you want to do them, you got to do them yourself, or find a way for the community to come alongside that. Again, there's formation. You have to build that within the community. You can't just assume people will just sort of figure it out. And I mean, I don't have any notion around leadership development, but I'm just going to suddenly lead. Doesn't usually happen that way. There needs to be empowerment and some formation around it. But yeah.
Great. Something else I read in there that I appreciated was you talking about proximity mattering with people and churches. So I don't know. I live certainly in the suburbs of the Denver, Colorado area in the metro, and I've gotten in this kick on YouTube of watching like urban planning and transit oriented themed videos. I try to take light rail in my part of the world when I can, and kind of bemoan where I live, and driving everywhere. So I was intrigued by your model of proximity mattering. Talk more about that.
Well, yeah, I would change parts of what I have written because I myself have changed in my approach to this because of COVID and what it's taught me in terms of inclusion for community, particularly around online. So I think given a choice, we would rather hang out around the dinner table and do life together rather than, let's say, do an online service. I think there's just power in incarnational presence, of touch, of feel, of smell, of seeing one another. But online, you can see one another, and it really enhances accessibility for especially disabled folks. So now my church is only online. We still do in-person things when the weather's warm, but it's only online. And it stretches across 2 different cities primarily. But would it be better if everyone lived in the same neighborhood? It would be different. When I wrote this, I was sort of critiquing what you have described. And that is our cities are definitely built around this inner city and suburban model. The suburbs, in many respects, lack vitality because they lack services. They lack density. They're racialized. And so there are a lot of problems. I'm pressing against, I think, commuter church. I don't think there's power in that. I think it's pragmatic versus it's a good reflection of incarnational presence. I remember having a conversation with the pastor at a megachurch. A megachurch in Canada is like a few thousand. It's not like the US where it's like 10 or 100,000. And he said it was a good thing. He thought it was an indicator of deep commitment that people had to commute to one another for 30 minutes. And I'm just like, are you for real? You think that my time is better spent in my car driving 30 minutes to a service to be with anyone, that's indicative of yes, it is commitment. Absolutely.
Right.
But that our time is better spent doing that than spending the 30 minutes eating together when we could just walk across the alley and we could be together in proximity. So that's what I mean by proximity matters. We have really elevated through that consumer church model, this notion that you drive to the central place and get your services and programs versus you could walk there. You could bike there. It just changes life, and that really presses against a lot of cultural pieces that are part of America. Yeah. They're part of Canada too. Like we're just, if you live in the suburbs, you got to live a different life.
Yeah.
Right? And a lot of it's in your car. Yeah. And that sucks.
I can attest to that, unfortunately. Well, let me ask you here kind of 2 questions, 2-part question, at least before we take a break. You mentioned that, in your churches that you've led, you've been not part-time, not certainly not anywhere close to full time. If I understand your bio right, you have an MDiv, so you've been to seminary, you've done that. What advice do you have for pastors or church leaders who are like, hey, I need to try to figure out how to make this work financially, but also, I've got my education that I've got to pay for, whatever. And then let me ask it this way. You're right. Sometimes risk takers are left outside to freeze. How do we not get stuck outside in the cold?
Yeah. And I can say a lot of things because I have nothing to lose. I never had anything to begin with. So it's easy to be like, what are you doing? Like, you're not taking any risks. And for the pastor who doesn't have transferable skills, has been in the pastorate for decades upon decades, thinking about risking the whole church for the sake of a new idea, that's not, like, you got a mortgage to pay, right? So I don't think that's happening, which is why I would suggest be diligent with trying to fund even a small thing, but fund something that's an offshoot. Now, if you are that pastor who is risk-taking, who you have angst about what is happening within either your context, it is isolating to be on the outside looking in. It's obscure. That's part of it. It's not a good part of it. Like I started with, the prophets are pushed to the margins. They're sent to the wilderness. You will meander the wilderness, and it's lonely, which is really crucial. Why it's crucial to find your people as you're venturing, whether they're in-house in the church, maybe not, in the denomination, maybe not, maybe in your neighborhood, to find cohorts along the way, or else you're going to be venturing alone. And that's not good. But to try to start new things in-house within, I don't think you can. And you might have high vision, grand vision to change what's on the inside. It's really hard to change the DNA of organizations once they're already established, including churches. Most often, if you want to try something new, especially if it's radical, you got to start with new DNA. You got to start fresh. You got to start brand new. So that's the reality. And when you do start brand new, then you will be on your own in many respects. So I don't recommend venturing alone. I do recommend responding to calling and making big jumps for sure. Some of them are unnecessary. Some of them can just, again, test that small thing. But as you do that, be sure to try to surround yourself. And again, even online, right? That counts, to find your people who are asking similar questions. They're probably out there.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Again, the book is Thrive. Check it out at Rohadi's website. Let's take a break, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Rohadi Nagassar. And thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate the conversation and your insights and ideas here. Have some closing questions. You can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. So if you're Pope for a day, what would you like to do with that day?
Yeah. I guess I took this one serious.
That's good
Pope
too.
for the day. What could you do in a day if you're Pope?
Yeah.
Or what could Obama do for 8 years, right? Did he solve racism? No. Like, you can't move institutions in a day. But in this mythical world that you have posed,
right?
Pope for a day, I'd sell all the properties and pay reparations. That's it.
That's a big day then. That's a big day.
It would be. Hey?
You'd be signing paperwork the whole day, have hand cramp for sure.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. All right. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Because I don't know when you'll post this, so unfortunately I'll date it.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's Monday was MLK Day,
right,
in the US. And so, yeah, maybe the Reverend Doctor, because as I was reflecting on his life, we're the same age,
Hmm.
like, and part of that's like, and what have I accomplished?
Yeah.
But the other piece is like, and what would he have accomplished? So that would have been something.
Yeah, that's good. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
So you mean like broadly, like right now, this snapshot?
Yeah, I kind of leave it open-ended on purpose.
Yeah. I think there is going to be not a reckoning. We're going to get some more sense of the harm that COVID has caused, especially for those with long-term disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to come out, and the way that and if you want to talk about institutions, how institutional think around the pandemic response from many chief medical officers, it held on to old paradigm, and this is everywhere. It's like not even places where the government was more right or left leaning, and everywhere I mean in the West, so Canada, the United States. We did such a terrible job in terms of public health messaging all over the place.
Yeah.
And it just harmed so many people. And I don't think we've grasped the magnitude of that harm. So I think that's the space and the kind of a connection to that connection. Not really. Whenever I talk to Christians my age, Americans, not Canadians, almost all of them, and it might be the circle I travel, but almost all of them speak to Trump as the catalyst that changed their faith. And so that's a big piece of what was unleashed with all that Trump represented when he came into power.
Yeah.
But I think that's going to be something historically we look back on, even within the church, and be like, wow,
right.
Like that catalyzed a lot of people exiting.
Yeah.
And then it solidified a lot of people.
Right. Right.
And entrenched them.
Yeah. Certainly we're seeing that. I don't know what it looks like where you're at, but certainly in the States with Christian nationalism sort of being like the institutionalization of this whole mess.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the permission to do what was already there.
Right. Right.
And I don't think that it's necessarily been a catalyst to growth. But like I said, it's entrenched a particular way of thinking. Yeah. And polarized us. So yeah, those are two big ones.
That's interesting. I wish we had more time to talk about that. What are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
I do have hope. So my most recent book is When We Belong, Reclaiming Christianity on the Margins. And it's written to folks like me, and those who've been pushed to the margins by the dominant church traditions, to say that Christianity is a religion, it is a faith for those who are marginalized first. The last shall be first. And so I have hope because I look at the upcoming generation that's even behind me, and I see their intelligence around mental health and somatic healing, and just the theology that they're producing, the types of public theologians we have now. It's wild. I think like you're just like miles ahead where I was when I was your age. So that gives me hope when it comes to seeing new voices, and especially voices from the margins. So usually racialized minorities come into the center and start speaking renewed truth. To me, that's exciting. Does that save institutional Christianity? Does that save the Presbyterians, the evangelicals, the Pentecost? Does it save them? No. And I don't care if they're saved, right? Because I don't have any skin in that game. But I do see Christianity as a movement. It's still rolling, right? It's still expanding in places outside of the West where it's declining, right? So yeah, there's hope.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. I think I'm remembering, I think you tweeted something not too long ago, something about many interpreters of scripture only have done so from a place of privilege or something to that effect, right?
Yeah. Even our traditions in the West, in America and the United States, have come through the gaze of usually a white male, Eurocentered gaze of understanding Scripture. And these are not people who've ever been subjugated by the state. Yeah. Yet the first 3 centuries of the writers of the New Testament, of the early church, they were marginalized. And so it requires a certain perspective of the world to glean the stories of Jesus, as Jesus, the subjugated, in the process of being colonized by Rome, Jewish minority figure that he is, right? And it produces a different kind of Christianity, I think, as well. So, yeah, that's a compelling thing for especially folks who've grown up in dominant or mainline or evangelical traditions that aren't Black or Orthodox. There's just different ways of approaching our faith that we haven't even considered or fathomed.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Well, share, if you would, where people can connect with you, check out your work, that kind of thing.
I'm easy to find if you just Google Rohadi, Rohadi. I have a podcast as well. I have a newsletter. I don't blog as much, but I do have a newsletter on the website, rohadi.com, and the podcast is Faith in the Fresh Vibe, where I try to chat about all things decolonizing Christianity. And my latest book is When We Belong, which came out May 2022.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate your time. Really appreciate the conversation. I always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Thanks for having me, and also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.